Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialists will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Emily, a speed round of questions, if you're up for it.
Sure.
This is Emily Tamkin, a global affairs journalist, and we're talking about a bill just passed by the House that does different things depending on who you ask and how you phrase the question. Do you think most people would support a law that says Americans held hostage abroad should get extra time to pay their taxes?
Yes, I do.
Okay. What about a law that says nonprofits shouldn't be able to funnel money to terrorists?
Of course.
Okay. Now, if you asked people whether Congress should pass a law that makes it easier for the president to punish his critics, what do you think they'd say?
I would hope that they would say no.
The Stop Terror Financing and Tax Penalties on American Hostages Act does two things, as the title suggests. It prevents the IRS from charging penalties on late taxes to Americans held hostage abroad. No one objects to that part. The problem, Emily says, comes with the Stop Terror Financing part, which sounds good on the surface. But she argues it's extraordinarily vague, with the power to strip nonprofits of their tax-exempt status, effectively crippling them.
The second part of this bill is, I think, quite misleading because it is not currently legal for an NGO to support terrorism. What this bill does is it speeds up the process, right? It basically strips out due process and says the Secretary of Treasury can, at his discretion, say that this nonprofit is supporting something that fits the definition of terrorism. And now you can say, well, we have a definition, so it's whatever fits that definition. And I would just say that every definition, particularly of concepts like terrorism, is open to interpretation. So it's at the Secretary's discretion, which is to say it is at the discretion of a political appointee.
This bill had pretty wide bipartisan support until Donald Trump was elected and started naming his cabinet. Now, some Democrats are considering how a bill like this could be weaponized by someone who has promised to go after his enemies once he's elected.
A university has too many protests against Donald Trump. Terrorists. Environmental group suing the administration in court. Terrorists. Think tanks that think differently than Donald Trump. Terrorists.
Here's Representative Jim McGovern of Massachusetts speaking on the House floor.
That's what this bill does. People say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, Mr. Speaker, the road to fascism in America is paved with 1 million little votes that slowly erode our democracy and make it easier to go after anyone who disagrees with the government.
Republicans call this political hysteria, but Emily argues there's reason to be alarmed.
When you pass legislation like this, you make it easier for those who want to grab power to use that power against one of the checks against them, which is NGOs, which is nonprofits, which is people on the streets. I don't want to sound melodramatic here, but this legislation, if enacted, would further empower the executive branch to curb freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and really really fundamental rights in this country.
Today on the show, the bill known as the Nonprofit Killer. I'm Yasmin Khan, in for Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. This episode is brought to you by Home Chef. All of us dread the what should we have for dinner question. And so often it leads to ordering takeout from the same old places, which might be the easiest option, but it's never really all that satisfying, and it costs a whole bunch. So if you'd rather enjoy a home-cooked meal without the stress of planning ahead, Home Chef makes it pretty easy, and it could even save you some money. Home Chef sent me a few of their meal kits to try out. My whole family appreciated the recipes so much that we actually kept a few so we could replicate them ourselves. We also appreciated the fact that everything was all measured out for us already. We just had to mix up the meal and enjoy. Home Chef provides fresh ingredients and chef-designed recipes conveniently delivered to your doorstep to simplify your cooking experience. Whether you prefer classic meal kits with pre-portioned ingredients and easy instructions, or speedy recipes ready in less than 30 minutes, oven-ready kits with pre-chopped ingredients, or quick microwave meals, Home Chef has you and the entire family covered. Not only is it convenient, but it's economical too. Home Chef customers say that they save an average of $86 per month on groceries. For a limited time, Home Chef is offering my listeners 18 free meals, plus free dessert for life, and of course free shipping on your first box. Go to homechef.com/whatnext. That's homechef.com/whatnext for 18 free meals and free dessert for life. You heard that right. homechef.com/whatnext. You have to be an active subscriber to get that free dessert.
The Stop Terror Financing and Tax Penalties on American Hostages Act has been a work in progress for about a year now. An initial version was introduced last November, soon after Israel's war in Gaza began. Lawmakers saw pro-Palestinian demonstrations cropping up at tax-exempt universities and wanted to make sure that they and other nonprofits weren't sending money to help groups like Hamas.
So that is the context in which this bill exists. At the time, one of the sponsors, Congressman David Christoff from Tennessee, said, "I urge the swift passage of this legislation that will significantly diminish the ability of Hamas and other terrorist groups to finance their operations and carry out future attacks."
And it is already illegal for nonprofits to support terrorist groups.
Yes, you would already be charged under the Anti-Terrorism Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. There have already been charities that have been shut down under existing legislation. The problem is that there are those who say, well, the existing legislation is too slow, it's too bureaucratic. And basically what this legislation would do would be to allow the Treasury Secretary to, without explanation, without evidence, without a whole process or procedure, say, I think this group fits the definition of terrorism. Therefore, it is not really a nonprofit. It should lose its tax-exempt status.
So you're saying that essentially this new law sidesteps process?
Absolutely. And I think it's important, I'm sure that there may be people listening to this who are saying like, well, why should there be bureaucracy, right? Like, why should these groups get tax exempt status if they're supporting terrorists? And I just think it's important to think about all of the different groups that have been accused of being terrorist organizations at some point in the very recent past in the United States. There were police departments that said that Black Lives Matter was a terrorist organization, or aid groups that work in places in the world where, there are different militant groups operating, but their job is to bring in food and water. So, there's a reason that people are worried that Oxfam could be caught up in this.
So, up until about a month ago, this bill had relatively strong bipartisan support. In a vote back in April, it passed the House 382-11. Does that bipartisan support surprise you?
Unfortunately, the bipartisan support does not really surprise me because I live in Washington, D.C. I've reported on foreign affairs. I know that nobody in Congress, or very few in Congress, would be happy being seen as being soft on national security. And most people in Congress, I would say, are worried about being seen as soft on national security and soft on terrorism. So no, it wasn't surprising to me that it had bipartisan support. So the April bill, as you said, passed. Only 11 people voted against it. The vast majority of those, 10 of them were Democrats. And then it sort of sits in the Senate Finance Committee and doesn't move ahead. And then around September 11th of this year, a new version of the bill was introduced again. And the difference is basically by the time it came to a House vote, Trump had been elected.
So that's why Democrats started to look at this bill differently because of who they knew would be in the White House.
Yeah, I mean, you would hope that particularly a party that sort of brands itself as being more in support of our various foundational civic freedoms, that it wouldn't matter who is in the White House. There should be due process for nonprofits. But I think it probably doesn't hurt to have a president-elect who says things like, oh, we should shoot protesters in the legs, or, oh, I can't wait to deport student protesters, to make clear that perhaps this isn't something you should be supporting.
Right. I mean, Republicans are saying that this is Trump derangement syndrome, that the reason why Democrats are sort of withdrawing their support, that they should support the bill no matter who's in the White House.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at it in one of two ways. You can say, oh, they were against it. It's only that Trump is in the White House. Or you can say the fact that a person who is so clearly antagonistic toward nonprofits and toward his critics and toward people who disagree with him, the fact that he's coming in has made clear the problems that were already there and why Democrats should have been against the bill in the first place.
So even with many Democrats withdrawing their support, on November 21st, the House passed the bill in a 219 to 184 vote. Who are the Democrats who are still supporting this bill? There are still about 15 who joined the Republican majority for this.
Yes. So there was Brad Schneider of Illinois, who is one of the sponsors of the bill originally. He had asked for an amendment to be put in that would add some due process. That amendment was not included, and he voted for it anyway. You know, there's Tom Suozzi of Long Island, who has branded himself as sort of like a moderate Democrat and thinks that that's where the future of the party should be, needs to be. There was Jared Moskowitz and Debbie Wasserman Schultz of both of Florida, who continued to support the bill.
And why are they saying that they still support this bill?
I mean, I think their point is we supported it before. We support the principle. It doesn't matter to us who's in the White House. I also think it's really important to note that I think for some, voting against this bill either will be seen as or could be seen as not standing up to anti-Semitism. So it's not only worrying about being seen as tough on national security, tough against terrorism, it's also not wanting to be seen as soft on anti-Semitism. And I think it's important to note that 55 Jewish groups, including like the Reform Movement's political arm, which is the biggest Jewish denomination in the country, came out and said, do not support this thing, right? Like this does not make us safer. Actually cracking down on civil liberties is not good for ethnic, cultural, religious minorities. That includes us. Vote against this bill.
It's notable that Democratic leadership in Congress does not seem to be trying very hard to bring attention to the bill. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries voted against the bill, but he doesn't seem to have tried to whip up Democratic members in opposition.
I think that's right. That in Schumer, whatever is happening behind closed doors, this is not something that he's really been out in front on. Schumer has been publicly quite quiet on the issue. I think there are those who worry that this will be a wedge issue in the Democratic Party, that it will split those on issues of like civil rights versus national security. How do you really care about anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera?
I mean, let me just ask the obvious, or let me ask perhaps a naive question. I mean, why not speak out against the bill at this point? Why not own the issue?
I think Democrats are reeling right now. I think Democrats are not sure, they lost the White House, they've lost Senate, they did not take back the House. There's all this conversation about which way do we run as a party? Are we out of touch? Like who do we blame? And I think that there are those who don't want to be seen as speaking or being or running too far to the left. And I just want to say personally, I completely agree with you. Like, I think that those who I think those who think, oh, the way forward is to present ourselves as moderate on the issue of whether or not we hand the Trump administration tools to go after nonprofits, I think that's a bad bet, right? It's a bad bet politically, and I also think it's a bad bet for keeping the checks that we need to stay in place in a functioning democracy.
After the break, how might this legislation change civil society if it takes effect?
Planned Parenthood Federation of America exists so that all people can get access to the sexual and reproductive care and education they need to make informed decisions about their health. More than 2 million patients a year rely on the services Planned Parenthood health centers provide, like STI testing and treatment, birth control, gender-affirming care, abortion, cancer screenings, and so much more. Right now, all across the country, reproductive health care and rights are under attack from public officials who are out of step with the will of the vast majority of Americans. The constitutional right to abortion, control of our bodies, and the health care we need has been stolen from us. And now politicians in 47 states, yes, 47, have introduced bills that would block people from getting the sexual and reproductive care they need. Planned Parenthood knows that equitable access to health care, including safe, legal abortion, is a human right. Right now, Planned Parenthood needs your help to protect access to health care. Donate today by visiting plannedparenthood.org/protect.
Support comes from USA for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. This winter, your gift to USA for UNHCR will make all the difference. As temperatures drop, your generosity brings critical relief to those forced to flee and facing winter far from home. Your gift to UNHCR gives core relief items like food, blankets, shelter, and fuel for heaters. These life-saving essentials are quickly transported to warehouses around the globe, ready to be delivered by UNHCR's dedicated teams. It's a race against time to provide more than just the basics for those in need. UNHCR's swift response, fueled by your support, ensures refugees and displaced people receive life-saving aid, helping them survive the harshest conditions. UNHCR is committed to using every dollar wisely and turning your compassion into action. Help those in need stay warm and safe. Your gift is matched for a limited time. Give now at unrefugees.org/winter.
I want to talk about what this legislation would look like for nonprofit groups if it were actually put into effect. So can you explain to me the mechanics of the proposed law and how an organization might ultimately lose its tax-exempt status?
Yeah, so essentially what happens per the text of the legislation is the Treasury Secretary can say, you meet the definition as qualifying as terrorist supporting. You, the NGO, then have 90 days to demonstrate to satisfaction of the Secretary that you aren't terrorist supporting. If it cannot do that, you lose your tax-exempt status. Rescinding the designation is also up to the Secretary, who doesn't need to provide any evidence or any explanation. So I think what is important to note here is how deliberately ambiguous this is. Yes, it is true that we have a definition, a legal definition of terrorism, but is it supporting terrorism to, I don't know, meet with somebody who has met with members of a terrorist organization? Look, we've seen how people accuse UNRWA of being terrorist supporting, right? Because of who might be in UNRWA and who are they delivering food to and aid to. So I think this will do two things. First of all, I just think realistically, if this is passed, and this is something that the administration actually takes an interest in, that we will see nonprofits lose their tax-exempt status, and that will make it much more difficult for them, if not impossible for them to operate. I would also imagine that for some, you see a chilling effect. So I mentioned earlier that there are major progressive foundations, or just foundations generally. We're thinking of Ford, Tides, Open Society, that give money to groups that are, in favor of pro-Palestinian rights, or like Black Lives Matter, that protest state-backed violence, et cetera. Do those checks still get written out? Right? If you're worried that one day one of your recipients might be accused of being terrorist supporting, do you still give to them? So the phrase chilling effect is almost too weak because it cuts the knees out from under the whole civil society sector. and I think could end up deliberately cutting whole swaths of society sort of out of civil society.
Yeah. And it sounds like you're saying that the Treasury Department it's not that they're saying we're investigating you for supporting terrorists. It's that they're saying we are designating you as an organization that is supporting terrorism. Prove to us that you're not.
That's absolutely right. Yes. And how do you prove that if you don't believe that you're a terrorist supporting organization, right? Like if your mission is such that you have been accused of supporting terrorism, but you are not actually doing that, how on earth? It doesn't matter if they give you 90 days. You could have 90,000 days. You would never be able to prove that to their satisfaction.
Some 300 nonprofit groups, I believe, have written to congressional leadership pushing back against this bill, saying that the new law would completely sidestep due process. Are they right? Are there any guardrails?
I think they're absolutely right. And you know that they're right because there was a chance to add in an amendment with more due process, and that ultimately did not make it to the vote. Again, it's important to remember we already have legislation that makes it illegal for these groups to support terrorism. But the problem for proponents of this bill is that, it's too bureaucratic, it's too cumbersome. Well, another way of looking at that is that there's too much due process for these people. No, I think groups are right to say that there's no due process, and I think they're absolutely right to say that that it empowers and enables executive overreach.
And even if, say, they are able to prove that they're not supporting terrorism, it sounds like it's damaging anyway to have that label.
Of course. I mean, like, okay, let's hypothetically say that you're a group and you've been accused of terrorist supporting, and somehow, some way, in 90 days, you're able to convince the Treasury Department, no, I'm not. Who are these groups who are going to want to risk their tax exempt status by working with you? Like you've now been branded as a terrorist supporting organization. It makes I can remember speaking to a person who worked for an NGO for LGBTQ rights in Hungary. And what he said to me was, as an NGO, really all you have is your credibility. Really all you have is that people believe you're doing the work that you say you're going to be doing. And once that is taken from you, once you are smeared as somebody else's stooge or a foreign agent or is trying to degrade the nation, you can't do your work. Like you can't, it doesn't matter what you say because nobody believes that you're really there in good faith. And so I think aside from the practical issues, right, like aside from groups losing their status, it's an attack on the credibility of these groups, which is to say an attack on the credibility of, individuals who work to check the worst excesses of the government.
In your writing, you draw a pretty direct line from this bill to authoritarianism based on what we know from other countries. Where do laws like this already exist? And what kind of impact have they had?
Yeah, I mean, this is the sad thing, right? We actually don't need to imagine what this could look like. We know we could look to Russia, where anti-terrorism laws have been used to chill dissent and cut down organizations and actually imprison people who just say something, right, or just post online. We can look at, in 2021, Israel labeled 6 Palestinian groups like Defense for Children Palestine or the Union of Agricultural Work Committees to be terrorist organizations. We can, not to go back to Hungary, but we can look at Hungary where it's not quite the same, but where groups have been labeled foreign agents and as such have found it difficult, if not impossible, to continue the work that they wanted to do. And unfortunately, I don't think we can look to any of those countries and say that they're really beacons of liberal democracy right now. And I do think that these laws are a part of that.
It's not hard to guess what kinds of groups the Trump administration might target if this bill becomes law. Emily says pro-Palestinian groups like Jewish Voices for Peace would probably be up first, with organizations like Black Lives Matter to follow. But it's important to remember the nonprofit world is vast. It's not just charities and advocacy groups. It's news outlets and universities, too. And these organizations would be equally vulnerable if the act were to pass.
I am sure that last November, when Brad Schneider was co-writing or co-sponsoring this legislation, he wasn't thinking, like, I can't wait to help the Trump department crack down on education, right? Like, this is a Democrat from Illinois. I'm sure that was not his intent. But now, given the political reality we are in now, it is difficult for me to separate this from Trump's pledge to go after higher education. and to use claims of terrorism and ostensibly the fight against anti-Semitism to do it. In other words, I think it's important to not look at this legislation just as by itself. Like, there's a broader political context here that includes going after universities, going after the press, right? Going after all of these institutions outside of government that help keep us a pluralistic liberal democracy.
Of course, the bill still has to pass the Senate before it becomes law. Is that likely to happen?
I think not this Congress, right? I think not while Democrats have the Senate. Next year, when Republicans take the Senate, if they decide that this is a priority for them, then yes, it would likely be legislation, which is I think why we've seen nonprofit groups that are against this bill sort of not take their foot off the gas, right? And have said, like, keep calling your legislators, keep telling your senators, no, I don't want this, keep speaking up against it. And why I actually, unfortunately, think that this is the very beginning of the story for this legislation and legislation and policies more generally like this.
Yeah, it strikes me that this bill is only the latest manifestation of this broader desire to tamp down on dissent. For example, an Indiana University scholar, Beth Gaisley, she studies nonprofits and local governance, she found that at least 22 states have either passed new laws restricting protests or tightened laws that were already on the books. Universities have come up with new rules to contain or possibly dissuade protests. So my question to you is, what kind of climate do you think results from all these laws surrounding public advocacy and organizing?
It's just a less productive climate, right? It's a less protective one in the sense that many of these groups exist to fill some need that hasn't been filled by elected officials, right? Like there's a reason that the ACLU exists to make sure that even when politicians fall short on protecting free speech, others don't. There's a reason that various human rights groups and LGBTQ groups, et cetera, like, they exist because sometimes, unfortunately, maybe often, elected officials don't fully represent all of the people, all kinds of people in this country. But I also just think what I mean by it when I say it's just a less productive country is that, and not to sound too Pollyanna about this, but like coming together for discussion and debate and disagreement and dissent, that's how policy improves. That's how lives improve. And you can't do that if you have shut down those who disagree with you by calling them terrorists and stripping them of their nonprofit status.
Emily, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Emily Tamkin is a global affairs journalist and the author of The Influence of Soros and Bad Jews. And that's the show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. We're led by Alicia Montgomery. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Yasmin Khan, in for Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.
If you're a maintenance supervisor for a commercial property, you've had to deal with everything from leaky faucets to flickering light bulbs. But nothing's worse than that ancient boiler that's lived in the building since the day it was built, 50 years ago. It's enough to make anyone lose their cool. That's where Grainger comes in. With industrial-grade products and dependable fast delivery, Grainger can help with any challenge, from worn-out components to everyday necessities. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.